Hi everyone, and welcome to Dungeons and Die Rolls. In this episode, I'm going to be talking to you about how I go about choosing a role-playing game. I'm choosing to do this video for a couple of reasons. First, it's something that's immediately pertinent to my life. I just went through choosing a new system with my current group of role players to start a new campaign in. And it's also something that I see pretty frequently when I'm browsing the internet and forums and Facebook and Meetup. I see a fair number of discussions and groups and questions about how do I choose a game. In my opinion, and of course everything here is my opinion, but the best way to do this has a few steps and two halves. I know this sounds like it's complicated. Two halves with a few steps. It's not that bad, but I think it will be fun to talk about, and hopefully for you fun to listen to me talk about. I get to proselytize about role-playing games. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to find a good group to play with. And I do see this mentioned sometimes, but I feel like it's a really underrepresented part of the equation because I see a lot of sort of internet ads on various sites for people who are just looking for a group, and they're going to magically have fun with whomever they find to play with. And my experience with this kind of game is that that's just not the case. And so I think that finding a group bears some discussion before you even worry about what kind of game am I going to play. I'm hoping that this information will be of some use to both people who are used to role-playing games and maybe want to come up with a better or more refined system, or just have some new ideas. And I also hope that this can be a good informative video for people who don't currently play role-playing games and are looking to get into it. And this is some of my advice about how you do that to maximize your happiness, which is what playing games is about, right? Cool. So to find a group, there are two things that you need to know about the people you're playing with before you can choose a game to play with them on a long-term basis, like a campaign. Thing point 5, you want to know what they're like as people, right? You want to make sure you get along with them. That being presumed that you do. You want to know what they're like in terms of role-playing because you're playing role-playing games, and so you want your styles and ideas to have at least some degree of commonality so that you're going to get along with each other in terms of that. And then you need to know how well you, as people with brains, parse systems of different complexity before you can really decide as a unified whole what kind of game you want to play, what system you want. So here's how I approach this when I am a DM looking to form a group. And I did this somewhat recently over the summer. I got everything that I needed. I got a new house all set. I got a nice gaming room and area. And I decided, hey, I have the time. I really want to start up. It's been a few years since I'd done a solid role-playing campaign. I want to get a group. So if you're a DM, you need to be a little picky, I think, about who you're playing with. Don't just take anybody, because then you're going to get into campaigns with people that, you know, you're telling the stories to people about how there's this one guy in your group who's the obnoxious guy trying to force you to give him special rules and accommodations, and who wants to deal with that? So you just don't have that guy be in the group to begin with. All right, so let yourself be picky. This process may take some time depending on who you meet. But I invite people to come over, play a one-shot of a game, something that's just self-contained. That's it. One evening, that's it. No presumption that you're ever going to see my house again. If they are brand new to role playing entirely, and this is for you as players if you're brand new to role playing entirely, you might want to find a game that has still some DM direction. So for that, I like to do Dread. Dread is very rules light. The only thing you need to learn to play Dread is something you probably already know, which is how to pull a block from a Jenga tower and put it back on top. That is the only rule in Dread. Character creation is filling out a questionnaire that's provided by the DM. You answer some questions about your character in the game, and that establishes kind of what you know, what items you might have on your person. And then from there on, it's a suspense horror game, and when you say that you're doing something risky, you have to pull some number of Jenga blocks, and if you knock over the tower, then at some point your character is going to die. It's very fun and very simple for people who have never played role-playing things before. No rules to learn, nothing to memorize. They have their character in front of them, and they tell the story, and they pull a tile when they need to. If you're interviewing people who say they have played role-playing games before, then I want to know what kind of role player they are. And this could be if you have a bunch of newbies and you did a Dread game, then maybe you go to this. Or if you're starting off with people who have all told you, yeah, I've done RPGs, then you start on one of these. I like to do player-driven role-playing based games. So still very rules light, not getting into any rules complexity here, but it's taking the driving onus away from the DM and putting it into the player's hands so that you get to more sit back and just kind of say, okay, so what kind of role players are these people? Do they think well on their feet? Do they come up with things that are creative or interesting? Are they all kind of goofy people? Do I want that or not? Does this guy sit on his phone when he's not involved in doing it? You get to see that kind of thing. There are a few good systems for that. I happen to have, there's a penny for your thoughts, for my thoughts, a penny for my thoughts, which is an improv-based RPG. You're helping each other to tell stories that represent memories from your past. And there is, in fact, no DM. The closest there would be is if there's someone who needs to be reading through the steps in the rules to help guide the game. But it's very easy to create a one-page reference sheet for everyone so that you don't even need to be doing that. And then it's just completely cooperative, player-driven role-playing. Another game that I really like for that, when played properly, is 10 Candles. The played properly with the head tilt thing is because it's easy for games like this to not be player-driven. I had a hard time coming up with a good play example when I was looking up 10 Candles, because all the games that I found recordings of and play sessions of were the DM prattering and occasionally giving the players a choice to react to, which is the complete opposite of what the book says you should be doing. According to the book, this game is prepless. You lay out a stack of index cards that the players will be creating their characters on by writing traits. You have 10 candles and a bowl to put ashes in, because you're actually burning the traits of your character as you use them in extraordinary scenes. You're sort of activating this trait, and then you're burning it. And when you have burned all of your character's cards, you'll die. And everyone is going to die by the end of your story in 10 candles. Guaranteed to be one-shots. Everyone dies at the end. But it ought to be The only thing the DM does is he lays out a basic premise. Here is the story. You're here. This has happened to the world. Go. And the players should be telling everything that happens. And then the DM reacts when they fail a roll or when they need some description of what's going on around them, what they see in a new area. Very good for helping to gauge what new players are like with role-playing. So you've done that. You've gotten an idea of some people whose role-playing styles you think match yours. Now you want to know what kind of rules complexity you're looking at when you're choosing a game for a longer-term campaign, because there are all different levels that support campaign play. You can technically, there are some rules in Dread to do that, and that's as rule simple as you get. Pull a Jenga tile. But what I would do at that point is I would invite back, and maybe if I were lucky enough to have enough people for this, maybe I would do this, on 2 evenings, so I have enough people that did well with the role-playing round that I would invite back for this. So I'm going to run another series of one-shots of games with different mechanical complexity to figure out how well all of them learn rules, remember the rules, how well they do relying off of reference sheets, how they learn games. So still very simple, but with more mechanical complexity than 10 Candles, Dread, Petty for My Thoughts. Something like Monster Hearts. Now again, this is a game that I have a hard time finding people playing right. You do whatever you want with your game. But for this system, as per the rules for Apocalypse World, which the system is derived from, it's supposed to be player-generated content. It is not supposed to be, we start playing and the DM is taking minutes at a time describing what's going on before getting your input. It's supposed to be, you do your character setup, which includes everyone creating their characters, and then some pre-game stuff. They recommend filling up your classroom. You're a bunch of teenage monsters. So you generate your classroom's worth of other characters, NPCs, and then the players take it from there. And the DM only reacts to their failed rolls. More mechanical complexity. You need a cheat sheet of rules, a reference sheet, to play this. You've got different actions, and they all work very similarly. They have the same die roll and the same kinds of consequences, but you need a reference sheet of what your powers are and what your possible actions are and how to interpret the different outcomes for all of that. Possible for campaign play. You can do what they call seasons in here. You advance your character in actually a couple of different ways, which is kind of cool. So that. Another game of minor mechanical complexity that's very fun to run with people is Fantasy Flight's End of the World series. This is actually very similar to All Flesh Must Be Eaten, except they have a bunch of books in different themes for it. So they have a zombie apocalypse, alien apocalypse, end of the world with gods, something else. But anyway, the rules, again, are simple, but more complex than anything we started with. You're going to want a reference sheet. There is actual character creation. The character creation is cool because you're supposed to be playing as yourselves in this alternate history setting where some kind of apocalypse is taking place. And so making your characters consists of, I have these points to allocate, I think these are my stats. And then there's a round of voting around the table. And so people can go, dude, you totally do not have a 3 attractiveness. I forget what the stats are called. No, you have to take that stat way down, and then you get hero points to boost things or something. It's been a while since I've actually played this, but you get something to compensate for it. The same thing can go upwards. Someone says, "Give yourself some credit, man. You're totally stronger than a 1." You have to boost that and then take something out of something else. But it's fun because you sort of playfully vote and evaluate each other. And then you play through an apocalypse. And this can be, you can kind of run this whichever way. I like to draw a lot from player input and then provide some story guidance. But they do give you a bunch of different scenarios in here that say this kind of zombie apocalypse or alien apocalypse, whatever book you get. There's each one of them has like 5 or 6 different scenarios for what the end of the world under that system looks like. So that's cool. And you can do some length of campaign with this if you want to. There's not a lot of choices for character advancement, but they do suggest something like they have 2 halves for every scenario. So one is during the apocalypse, and you figure out, what am I doing right now? How do I survive this immediate moment when all the zombies have just started clawing their way out of the earth or whatever they're doing? How do I survive and find a place of safety where my story can end? And then they do a post log where they have a second half for that scenario 10 years or something in the future. And they say, well, now it looks like this. And you've got some kind of modified post-apocalyptic cities or a dystopian future thing, and you can do another half of how I would play under that in that world. So those are my minor complexity systems that I would run a one shot with one of those with someone. I would just choose one. They're not different enough from each other that I would have someone do Monster Hearts and End of the World and something else. And if that's what I wanted to run, and what you had a bunch of players say they liked after playing the one shot, you could go ahead and you've chosen your game. You could play a campaign with Monster Hearts or End of the World. If you have something more complex yet in mind, do a one shot of it first. Still do a one shot. Still test that new level of complexity. Don't say, okay, they nailed the die rolls and different actions in Monster Hearts. Let's jump into Apocalypse World. Because there's a significant level of difference in the complexity there. And for an individual person, as opposed to a collective person. But each person's brain works differently, and so just because someone handled that level of complexity well does not mean that you can accurately predict how they're going to do with a higher level of complexity. I have had players who picked up Monster Hearts awesomely, played through End of the World, played through 10 Candles, did a great job, and didn't really have any rules questions while playing those games, didn't have any difficulty choosing things to do while playing those games. But then we played some Dungeons & Dragons, my preferred edition 3.5, and they badly floundered. And it was a mistake to try to play a longer campaign with those specific people using this rule set. You got to try it first, because again, unless you're sufficiently comfortable changing things after you get started and like telling people, kicking people out of something once you've started, once you start the campaign, you're stuck for some length of time with that choice and those players. You can scrap it and say, hey, you can make up a reason, this isn't going well, or you can tell someone in private, it seems like you're really struggling with this, would you prefer that we scrapped it and tried something else? But all of those are kind of uncomfortable options to me. I would sooner take the one additional evening to try a system out first before I start getting into all of that. So this is one system of higher complexity, the D&D, and which edition you choose will modify that complexity range slightly. 3.5 is definitely more complex. It's also why I like it the most, because 5th edition is, I would say, significantly less complex than 3.5, while still being more complex than the end of the world. But it is less complex in some of the choices of how to build your character and how to act in combat that I think sort of define why I would choose Dungeons and Dragons, the basic rule set. But that's a different conversation. Still, more complex in those things. Still, obviously suitable for a campaign. Another option for that more complex area would be Fate. I specifically love the Dresden Files. I love everything about them. I would have the Dresden Files books covering me in bed at night if I could. But the role-playing game is really well done. The Fate system was a great choice, but there's other alternatives. You have generic Fate that you can use for whatever genre setting you want. I believe there's free starter basic stuff for Fate. It's very role-playing based. One of the things I love about it is that it actually has mechanical rules for social encounters and combat. So when you get into a role-playing encounter, you have a goal. I want to find this piece of information. I want to make this person leave, something like that. And you have social stress and basically damage that you can take as you say the right thing and you inflict a negative emotion on the other guy and he takes social stress. And if you do that enough, then you win what your goal was. And he blurts out what you wanted to know, or he leaves, or she does things, whatever you want. Fantasy Flight Star Wars. Also a really great system, also definitely more complex. There's a lot of different actions in combat, especially if you're integrating space combat into it. Then you have a lot of stuff that you need to figure out how to do. Your character building can be quite complex. Lots of cool choices, but you've got to learn what everything does, and you've got to come up with a way to keep track of that all as you gather more abilities, and you have to reference stuff and keep it all up to date on a character sheet. The way that the dice work is awesome because the symbol-driven dice inform your storytelling. When you do a die roll and you see this kind of result is positive, but this kind of result was negative, what does that mean happens with my action? Very fun, very cool. It's complex enough that you need to do its own one-shot. The upside is there's a ton of them. Every rule book has a one-shot in it. Depending on the book you choose, they're of varying quality, which is a little sad, but they all have something. Each system also has a beginner's box, which you can get instead of buying the huge rule book right off the bat. You can choose one of the systems for the Star Wars and get the beginner's box, and that has the rules that you need to play that adventure, along with the adventure and like maps and tokens and dice and stuff like that. So they're actually a really good value and a good starting point. So once you've done that and you've established I have these players, they role play like this, they are capable of playing this level of complexity, then you actually choose your game. Here's what I did just recently for my process. I like to formulate the world based off of what everyone wants to do. Then choose a system that suits that. I do not, I don't grok the idea of I want to play a D&D campaign. Okay, why do you want to do that? Is it the only system you know? Is it you especially feel like rooting through books of feats? Why do you want to play specifically that? I want to play this kind of story because role playing is about the story, right? So I want this kind of story. So I like to establish with some generals and some specifics what kind of story everyone at the table would be happy doing for a while. If we're going to play a campaign, it's probably going to be for at least a couple of months. So I want to figure out what everyone would be happy doing and then use that to inform my decision, my choice of role-playing game, book, the system. So I started off with what setting? Do you want to do something that is fantasy or modern, sci-fi, alternate history, which could be steampunk, superheroes, urban fantasy, things like that. And right off the bat, choosing one of those settings is going to take an entire chunk of potential systems off your list, make this chunk of systems be your list. The next question that I asked, well, once they had said they wanted to do a fantasy game, we'd done some other stuff before that. We just got out of a Star Wars campaign, which was a blast. So they said they wanted to do a fantasy game, and I said, okay, so what kind of magic do you want? And this question I had pre-formulated with magic / technology for every entry, because whether they chose fantasy, modern, sci-fi, this question would have been the same, except it would have been magic or technology depending on what they chose. So do you want high magic where fantastical things are every place and common day? That would be something like your Eberron campaign setting, if you're familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, where they have magical teleporters in the cities and like rune-etched monorail systems, things like that. It would be the equivalent of Star Trek for sci-fi, where you have transporters and cellular regeneration and all these kinds of fantastical things happening. Do you want a medium magic setting where there are fantastical things that are possible with technology, but they're not commonplace? So that's kind of more your Forgotten Realms in D&D, where there are super powerful archmages that can do incredible things, but most people who are just living in the cities, they don't have access to those things. They don't really see it happening. For sci-fi, that's probably something like Shadowrun, where there's, again, high-level stuff possible, not necessarily commonplace. Or do you want a low magic setting where there's a very finite limit on what you can do with technology? That would be something like Star Wars, Firefly. Those are the technological options. For magic, that's Conan. So they chose fantasy, high magic. And then I asked them a few things about the flavor of the role-playing and the flavor of the story that they wanted to have. And this, I still use this to fine-tune what I offered to them in terms of settings. If they had said that they wanted something that was heavy on political machinations, if they wanted something that's getting Games of Thrones and there's lots of deception and trying to learn things going on, then I would have pushed for maybe using the Fate system, since it has that social combat system built into it. If they had said that they wanted something with a strong horror element, then I'm looking at maybe the Ravenloft books. There's, through all these things, lots of horror-oriented things that I could have looked at. As it is, I got saddled with a game that they wanted to be oriented in lots of combat. They said high ratings for hack and slash and um, comedy, which is my least favorite thing to have in role playing. I enjoy making nerdy and pop culture jokes with anyone as much as the next guy. I hate comedic roleplay, but I'm going to do it because it's what my players want to do. And to be honest, I've never actually tried to do it, so maybe I'll have more fun than I think I will. I just have this. I have an instinctive reaction against it because I've met so many people who um, act that way right off the bat as soon as you start to talk about role playing. As soon as you say, "Hey, let's try one shot of this," and their character, they want to be this goofy gnome whose stuff is blowing up in his face, or things that the internet has made popular. And those aren't the kinds of stories that I enjoy. I like actual serious stories. But anyway, hack and slash and comedy. Comedy really doesn't matter for the rule system. As part of the role playing is what you're going to do. So I knew that the social interaction wasn't a priority. They didn't care if that was present in the rules. And I know that we wanted a decently interesting combat system. To me, for example, D&D 5th edition would have been too simplistic to recommend based on those choices because a lot of the tactical options in combat got toned down or removed in 5th edition. So combat is much less complex and much less, I would say, interesting. Now, it is also easier to grok and can take less time to run. So those are good things about what the changes they made. But I wanted to preserve having some options. And I knew that for my current group, D&D 3.5 was too complex for some of them. I have a couple of players, and it's nothing against them. This is just how different people's brains work. D&D 3.5 is just too complex for some of these guys, and they slow down with the reference sheets of different actions, and they have a hard time processing it in good time so that the game doesn't slow down. So that was out. So I wanted something in between those levels of D&D 3.5 and 5th edition in terms of complexity. And what I came up with is this. Now, I had played Savage Worlds before. But this Explorers Edition uses an abstract combat system. And so this was one of my choices that I would use for my second stage of figuring out players. This is in line with End of the World, Monster Hearts, something using the Savage Worlds rule set was in there because the basic rules are very simple. You're rolling the same dice, not the same dice, but you're rolling a die every time and you're seeing if it's above this number. There you go, and you succeed or not. And then combat was abstract and story-based. Upon doing a little researching, I found out that this Savage Worlds Deluxe has rules for a grid-based combat system. So there's my combat that has some complexity. There are situational, location-based modifiers, ganging up on someone to get a bonus to your hit if you have allies adjacent. There's rules for cover, rules for range, but still much less detailed and less complex than D&D 3.5. And I was able to print off some sample characters that I whipped up at the end of our decision process of what they wanted to have in the campaign. I said, well, try this. We're going to try a fight. So I printed off characters along with a one-page reference that I made for combat. And for each person, it was less than 1 page. There's about half a page reference for combat and a little bit more for the mage character. And I handed out the sheets. We tried a round of combat. It went very quickly. There was little explanation to be done. The retention rate was good. People didn't have to keep asking questions about the rules that I had taught, and they enjoyed it. So this is what we're doing. We've started coming up with a world that we're going to be using for this campaign, and we've made characters. We're going to start playing this weekend, and so that's where we ended up. If I knew that all the players were good for it, I probably would have recommended D&D for this campaign, but this is where it pays for you as a DM, not so much new players getting into this, but you as a DM to try to be conversant with different systems. As you can see, I own a lot of things. You know, I have an entire closet full of role-playing books, and you don't have to go that far. You probably shouldn't go that far, but it is good to have options and to have some knowledge of different things, because I just don't think that it's a good or fun idea to say, all I know how to play is D&D. All I know how to play is GURPS, Fate, whatever, and so I need to post, I'm looking for players for my GURPS campaign. I think it's more fun, and you have a higher likelihood of successfully finding people that you can have a fun time playing with if you have some flexibility in what you can offer as an end result, and if you have some flexibility when you're deciding what to do. So those are my thoughts on how to choose a role-playing game. I would love to chat with you about this in the comments. I would love to answer any questions you have about any part of this or any of the systems that I talked about. And if you found any of this to be entertaining or useful, then please like, subscribe, tell me what else you'd like me to talk about. And I'll see you later.